In 1947, the Brooklyn Dodgers hired Jackie Robinson to be the first black player in modern Major League Baseball. Before then, black players were only permitted to play in a separate league. Robinson proved to be an immediate star and won Rookie of the Year and eventually MVP. The cultural effects of Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier are immense. But we, of course, are interested in the economics of the situation. By hiring Robinson, the Dodgers ended up selling more tickets at higher prices than they otherwise would have, and that was the motivation behind the hiring. Profit was the goal, and Jackie Robinson delivered. But the real mystery is why the other teams in the league were so resistant to hiring black players. They could have been earning more money. The market was literally charging them for their racism. I'm sure you've thought about and discussed economic discrimination before as we continue to have a national conversation about equality and equity. In this chart, we can see wage gaps between men and women across several ethnicities. The reasons for these differences are many, but unquestionably a major cause is bigotry and racism. But economic theory can help us locate the sources of some of that bigotry and racism. One explanation for these wage gaps is discrimination by employers. Some employers are just racist, bigoted, or just biased. In 2004, a bombshell study was published in the American Economic Review. Economists Mariana Bertrand and Senthil Mullainathan devised a clever experiment. They used a large database of names to identify which names were predominantly white and which names were predominantly black. Then they sent in resumes in response to help wanted ads. The resumes were identical except for the names at the top. They found that white names received 50% more callbacks for interviews than black names. Despite these findings, markets are a powerful tool to fight against employer-based discrimination. If employer-based discrimination is resulting in lower wages for black workers who are equally qualified as white counterparts, then I have $1 million idea for you. Hire black workers. Your firm will be just as productive, and you will pocket the difference. I'm being a little facetious, of course, but competition should eliminate these racial gaps. Racist employers should be driven out of business for not minimizing their costs. The economists Roland Fryer and Steve Levitt published a paper which spoke to this. They agreed with their data that people with black names had fewer employment prospects, but they didn't have lower incomes. In other words, there was sufficient competition for their labor that while they got fewer interviews, they ended up with jobs just as good. This kind of discrimination is insidious and morally objectionable, but thankfully markets are an ally in fighting it. Another source of discrimination could come from customers, though. A shop owner who's perfectly happy to hire a black woman might think twice if their customers will object. While this kind of discrimination has been diminished thanks to the hard-fought efforts of the civil rights movement and protests such as the Greensboro sit-in in the 1960s, there are still plenty of places where discrimination by customers allows wage gaps to persist. Country clubs are one such place where rules on who's allowed to be a member are often racial prejudice in disguise. This kind of discrimination can be eroded by competition of a different kind, though. The general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, Branch Rickey, didn't hire Jackie Robinson because he suddenly stopped being a racist. Instead, he had sensed that in 1947 his customers were finally open to the idea of watching a black player play. And when people saw Jackie Robinson tearing it up on the baseball field, they started to ask why he shouldn't be allowed to eat lunch next to them. The decline of employer-based discrimination at the hand of market competition also tends to erode discrimination by customers. Another place to look to see this in action are the discussions about equity in the workplace and representation in the media. Customer-based discrimination is probably what has kept women locked out of certain professions. But when people see examples which confront those assumptions start to fall away. Discrimination can also be persistent if it comes from other employees. Male firefighters have often objected to working alongside women, which has created a situation which is hard to break down. If male firefighters create environments unwelcoming to women, women will likely avoid that profession altogether. Similarly, in India, many object to working with Dalits, who are members of a caste considered impure by members of other castes. Often, this results in labor market segregation, and without direct competition, wage gaps can persist. But when we wonder why racial and gender gaps have persisted for so long, despite market forces working against them, it's important to remember that governments can be a major source of discrimination. Racial disparities have persisted in the United States as long as they have, in large part because it was the law. You can see it also in the history of apartheid in South Africa. Obviously, governments are imposing the will of bigoted citizens, but once these laws were repealed, the wage gaps began to shrink. Discrimination isn't just based on race or gender. Economic research reliably shows that taller people and people who are more attractive make more money on average than their short and homely peers. Markets tend to break down discrimination over time because profit-seeking employers are looking to hire the most productive workers. But this force is imperfect, and often discrimination, unfortunately, persists.